Today is really a great pleasure to have him here. The title of his talk today is Informative Fictions, Truth in Misinformation, Implications for Computational Research. So I'll just pass the floor to Dr. Margolin. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Song. I really appreciate it. Thank you for inviting me. I really was looking forward to this as well because this is based largely on a paper that I published in 2021. But for this talk, I kind of focused towards the end, in particular, on the implications for like what can computational researchers do with this, which I know is such a great strength of your department. And I'm sort of looking forward to the conversation. Okay, so let's get started. Let's begin with a well-known story, or at least a story I think is well-known to this audience. This is the text of the poem of Mulan. And here is a picture of depicting this story. And probably most of you know the story, but I'll recap it. Mulan is a girl or a young woman living, this is during the Northern Wei period, it's depicted. And her father, who is old, is drafted into the military. And in order to sort of save him from having to serve, he's too old, she decides that she will basically pretend to be a man and enroll in the military. And she's very successful in doing so. And when she returns home, sort of as a hero, she reveals her gender identity to her soldier comrades, and they, important to the story, accept her for who she is and realize that this is, that they still were glad to have fought alongside of her. And the question I want to ask here is this story true? Right? So when we ask the question, is it true? There's kind of two answers that we can get. One of them is it true about whether there was such a girl named Mulan who did these set of acts during the Northern Wei rule? And even in the poem, this is the English translation, of course, of the poem, but there's a mention of the cries of the enemy cavalry in the Yan Hills. And so you could ask, like, where she was marching and where the soldiers would have been, that she could have heard the cavalry and so forth. Like, there's all kinds of questions here about truth in this way. Right. And the historian's current, I don't know for sure, but the historian's current estimation is that it's possibly true, but it's doubtful, that there probably was not literally a girl named Mulan and that this happened. But there's another way of asking this question. Is it true about how many girls might have felt in an era of forced conscription of men? Is it true about how soldiers would feel fighting alongside a brave compatriot, even though they find out later that she is a woman, not a man? And this is again from the English translation. There's this quote, when the two rabbits run side by side, can you really discern whether I am a he or a she? This is in the poem. And the question is, like, is this true in a way, even if it's technically not true that there was a specific Mulan? And here the answer I would going to suggest is quite possibly, or at least it's true in a different way. So let's talk about this. Let's talk about this other way. Are these truths important? How girls might have felt in this era, or how soldiers would feel fighting alongside a brave compatriot? Is this truth important? And is it valuable, in other words, to understand people's emotions, perspectives, and intentions in particular places or times? Do we want to sort of have truth about how people have felt rather than just like what happened? And if that's true, what does that mean for communication? What does it mean that, like, we might want to know about this truth in addition to the other truth? In particular, because this means that perhaps we can get something valuable, right? This story is technically false. There isn't a Mulan, right? But maybe we can still get something valuable from something that is false. That's just sort of the setup for where we're going. So I'm going to argue that yes, indeed, there are two kinds of information that we need that are important for us to communicate to each other. One has to do with objects, or what we call theories of objects, like the moon, right? And when communicating about things like the moon, false facts are always bad. Misinformation is basically always bad. It's always misleading. However, when communicating about how people think and feel about their mind, it's more ambiguous, right? False facts are in some ways harmful, but in some ways can be helpful. And interestingly, that some ways, if we think about that some ways, It can tell us about why misinformation may be prevalent and when it may be popular. And importantly for us, computational work is uniquely positioned to research these ways because we can detect potentially when the kind of demand for this thing that misinformation supplies or can supply is higher or lower. So we'll talk about this. So now I'm just going to give a basic sort of overview of the talk. I'll start with sort of my background, the background and motivation, sort of like how I arrived at thinking about this. I think that's useful for students in particular to see how it's not a linear path. Then I'll go into detail of the theory of informative fictions, which is in the published paper. And then I'll talk about specific implications, specifically for computational researchers, how we can use this theory to do some interesting research. So first, I love computational methods in part because they really provide a unique opportunity for observation. Here are people pulling seawater out of the ocean in order to analyze it. And I feel like as computationalists, this is kind of like what we're doing. We download a bunch of data, right? And we just don't really know what's in there. There could always be something, just like pulling up water from the bottom of the ocean, that is surprising and that you don't expect. And this is especially useful, I think, for studying misinformation, because as researchers, as scientific researchers, we're kind of trained to make a lot of assumptions about what misinformation should look like or how it works based on our training to be scientific and therefore to kind of like root out all kinds of false thinking from our own ideas and our own arguments. So in a way, we have sort of the worst feel for misinformation because we're trained and selected to kind of like cut it out as soon as we see it. Whereas in everyday life, people aren't necessarily sort of like compelled to do that, and they may be more sort of facile and sort of working with it. So for this reason, it's very valuable for us to observe and learn from what we observe rather than just sort of use our gut reactions as researchers. Another thing about my background is I really like to find what I call functional explanations for dysfunctional things. I'll explain what I mean. It's very hard to conceive of systematic dysfunction, right? Dysfunction makes sense as a departure, right? That something works in a systematic and functional way, and then sometimes it breaks or it doesn't work. And so it makes it, we can see it and observe it, but it makes it sort of hard to predict it or bound it. We have to sort of like think about how the system is going to break. We can't think about like how it might work on its own. And as McGuire argues, finding a function can help you identify boundary conditions and potential remedies, right? If you think about like, oh, this thing that seems dysfunctional is actually trying to do or attempting to compensate or do this other thing, it can help you figure out like when will it be more or less prevalent, rather than trying to like predict when something will break, which seems like it's sort of more random. And just to be clear, because often when I talk about this research, people might get the impression that I'm defending misinformation. I'm not. I'm not saying that misinformation is good. I'm saying that we should think of it more maybe like a symptom, or it could be a symptom, right? When we're sick, we have symptoms like fevers that are unpleasant and potentially dangerous, right? But they're functional also. They're created by the body to fight off something that's even worse, at least from the body's perspective, which isn't to say that a fever is good or that we should just let it go or not address it. It's to say that it's kind of it's the surface level symptom of a deeper problem that the body is trying to fight. And similarly, perhaps misinformation is a dangerous response. It's definitely something that is problematic. We don't want misinformation, but maybe it's created in a sense to get at a deeper problem. And I'm going to argue that it can be, that it's about this ability to communicate certain kinds of information, that when we can't do it with the truth, then we'll look for other ways to do it because it's so important to communicate this information. And that's basically the question here. Could misinformation be responding to some need, right? And let's just look at some of the evidence for that. Like one, we know that false news is popular, right? We know that people really like it. It spreads farther and faster than real news, especially in certain groups. There's groups that kind of like sustain themselves almost on misinformation. We also know that fact checking, from my own research and other people's research, doesn't work particularly well. It works sometimes. It has a kind of weak or modest effect. And you might say, well, maybe just people don't know how to update their beliefs, or people are kind of irrational, and so they just aren't good at thinking about facts. But we know that that's not true, because teaching works quite well, right? So people are able to take, false beliefs and update them. It's just something about like these contexts where it doesn't seem to work, which suggests it's not that like people are irrational or can't use facts. It's like something about like in certain situations they're kind of moving away from them, and they're not paying attention to them. And there is out there now, and I've used this in my own research, a common proposal for why this is the case, what I'll call the truth versus tribe basically paradigm. And this is becoming increasingly popular as a point of view, especially given the sort of splits in like American political situation in the US, those of you who know about it, because there's kind of two sides of everything and so forth. And so there's this notion of like the truth versus the tribe, which is there's benefits to being right and accurate. There's also benefits to spreading untruths. And so people are kind of maybe in this trade-off where sometimes they want to be correct and sometimes they just want to be persuasive or get their way. And in my work, I define this as based on Philip Tetlock's work, as the difference between the intuitive scientist, right? Here's Marie Curie. She just wants to be accurate. She just wants to have the truth. And then we have the intuitive politician, and for who may not recognize this, is Bill Clinton, former president of the United States. And his goal is to just persuade you and kind of get his way. And he was known as being sort of like not very truthful person when he was a president. And so we kind of recognize that there are different motivations. Some people are trying to be accurate, or sometimes we're trying to be accurate, or sometimes we're trying to persuade people, get our way, build identity or cohesion, and so they don't care about the truth as much. And I've used this in my observational work, this basic paradigm, in these papers about fact checking. Said, when are people kind of motivated to be truthful, or when are they motivated to kind of be persuasive, or to kind of try to like get their way, to kind of spread their ideology or their point of view. And there's definitely evidence of this in Twitter. People are just trying to win an argument. But, and here's just one example of the kind of thing that you see online. This is a post on Reddit where someone talks about Bill Clinton and this woman that supposedly had an affair with him, and then she committed suicide, but it's false that there's no evidence that this woman ever had an affair with Bill Clinton. And this person corrects it by saying, no, here's a reference to a Snoping URL for Snopes that shows that like that's not true. But what I want to call our attention to here is what was actually written here. Because what's so interesting is that it's a very detailed, evocative story that seems to I'm talking about observation, pulling things out of the ocean. When I read this, I was like, this doesn't really feel like someone's just like trying to make a political point. They talked specifically about Susan Coleman, she's pregnant, her bags are packed. You repeatedly mentioned like her bags are packed, she was ready to leave, and then she committed suicide. It's sort of like there's something more than just saying like Bill Clinton is a philanderer, or that Bill Clinton, the implication here is that like he hires people to like, have people killed. This idea, and it's struck me as like this is really not. It's like it's very falsifiable. It's very detailed in a way that doesn't strike me as just besmirching his reputation. It's doing something more than this. I just couldn't know exactly what. We also know that there's something that goes beyond sort of just being like, truth or tribe, which is that people will admit in the Chadwick paper, 17% of Twitter users surveyed admit to sending information that they knew was exaggerated, right? So they kind of knew it and admitted it, right? And if they were just trying to spread propaganda, they would say, well, of course I think this is true. So that's kind of interesting. And we also know that rumors are often highly exaggerated versions of the truth, and often fantastical or supernatural, and don't particularly have ideology, a sort of tribal component. So this is one famous case. There was a study by Prasad of an earthquake that was in India in the 1930s, and he describes the rumors that flew around after the earthquake had happened. And people had these sort of prognostications about, the world will end, or they've heard about the sort of fantastical stories of people dying in these very sort of gruesome ways, or possibly surviving in these very heroic ways, that suggests that it doesn't really sound like science or politics, is what I guess I would say. It doesn't really sound like a logical argument. You can't really think people would believe those stories. But it also doesn't have a clear sort of like our tribal interest is served by spreading this idea. It seemed to be serving something else. So it started making me think like, is some informational function possible here? Are people trying to communicate something when they when they say something that's basically misinformation, besides just sort of like trying to get their way? Is there something they're trying to communicate? I don't really know what that is. Because if so, then the value of or need for the communication of this might compete with the kind of scientific communication. If there's something I want to tell you, then I can better tell you with a kind of fantastical story. And if you were sort of saying, no, 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 you can only tell me things that are factually true, I might say, but then I can't tell you this other thing that I need to tell you. Okay. So this leads a question we can ask. This is more just sort of setup. Can fiction have more impact than fact? And there's actually a couple of cases of this that are interesting. So one is, I'm not sure how familiar people are in this audience with this book, but this is a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was written in the 1850s in the United States, and it's a novel depicting slavery in the United States. And it was an extremely popular book. In fact, according to Wikipedia, it's the second best-selling book of the 19th century after the Bible. I don't know if that's true, but it's what Wikipedia says. And it was really powerful in galvanizing the abolitionist movement in the north of the United States against slavery. People read this novel and they said, that's it. I know now that slavery, I knew it was wrong, but it's so wrong now. I'm so upset by this. We have to do something about it. And you might say, well, of course, but they knew that it was based on fact, so it's like, it's a novel, but it's not really a novel. Except that what's interesting is that Harriet Beecher Stowe also wrote a kind of document version of this, a true only sort of documentary style version called the Uncle Tom's Cabin, a key, facts and documents upon which a story is founded, right? This is all the methodology and the detail. This is this like science behind the fiction, so to speak. And this did not cause a firestorm. In fact, most people don't even know that this exists. I only found this in researching it. So there's like a truth that didn't really have an impact. And then there's like this fictional version of the truth that did have an impact. So it's something communicated by the fictional version that's maybe not communicated here. There's something that people see here that they're not seeing there. And to return to Mulan, it's quite interesting. Again, the consensus is that Mulan is not there was no specific Mulan. But in this entry on the World History Encyclopedia, they mentioned that the fictional heroine has thereby brought actual heroines to light, because many other women in Chinese history actually did have some version of a story like this. It's not exactly this story, but like it's a thing that did occur. For example, there's I don't know how to say it, Jun Guan of Western Jin Dynasty. She was a 13-year-old daughter of a governor. And she led a team of soldiers, right? She was not drafted like Mulan was, but she maybe felt the same obligation to serve, right? And there's this Princess Pingyang of the Tang Dynasty, right, who had her own military that she trained, and she actually received military honors. Again, the point is she was not drafted like Mulan was, but in a way maybe she felt like Mulan felt. And there's something about the story of Mulan that leads us to understand this person's point of view, even if not their actual physical circumstance. Okay, so can we understand this sort of distinction in some kind of like rationalistic scientific terms? Can we kind of like make like scientific arguments from this distinction that we're sort of observing in a way that we can then do research on it, rather than just saying like, oh, fiction seems to be sort of different in some sort of general way that we feel? So I'm going to argue, yes, this is what the paper is about. And to do this, I'm going to start by pointing out that humans face decisions and how to relate to two different kinds of entities. They face important decisions in two ways. One is they face decisions about objects. These are things that do not have intentions towards us, do not theorize our behavior, and are not motivated to manipulate us. For example, the moon. The moon does what it does, it doesn't do it in order to like convince us to think of it in a certain way. The moon doesn't care what we think about it. It doesn't want us to trust it or want us to, love it. It just does what it does. And for these, we make what I call in the paper execution decisions. How should we interact with the moon or with an automobile, right? But we also have to make a lot of decisions dealing with things I call agents, things that do have intentions towards us, that do theorize our behavior, that can try to manipulate us, right? A person like Mulan. And for these, we make what I call relational decisions, decisions about how to interact with a social agent, something that can do these things. Some examples of relational decisions are things like, should I trust this person? Are they manipulating me? Can I intimidate or manipulate them? Should I compromise with them or should I escalate a conflict with them? These are all decisions that relate to how we relate to others that is distinct from how we relate to objects. When we try to predict these things, right, we wonder, how will this agent behave in response to my decision? How will this agent behave when I do something? What will they do in response? And I'll note here that the world is facing some important relational decisions right now, right? Everyone's wondering, what is he going to do? This is very important. What is he going to do, right? What these two individuals choose to do is something that we really need to know about, because many of our decisions are based on anticipating their behavior. And yet we know that they're also thinking about our behavior when they make their decisions. And this leads us to the question of like, well, what do we know about them? How do we make this kind of decision? And what we do is we need theories. And what the research shows is that there's actually two different kinds of theory out there. There's theories of objects, right? This is basically science. I put Popper here. This is not just Popper, but like theories of objects are basically what science is. And then there's something that cognitive scientists call theories of mind. And what I'm going to show is that these two theories are built in different ways and they're actually communicated in different ways. All right, so let's go through some of the assumptions of these theories. Okay. Again, objects are not motivated to manipulate. And because of this, it's safe to presume what we call mechanical consistency. You can assume that the moon, whatever you've observed about the moon in the past, is kind of consistent with how it will behave in the future, because it's not intentionally going to demonstrate one behavior in order to get you to do something so that it can do something else. But that's not true of agents. And I don't want to be picking on Putin here. It's true of all agents, right? They can be motivated to manipulate. And so it's not safe to presume that they're mechanical, right? Someone could be very consistent in their behavior because that's how they always behave. Or it could be because they want you to think that they're consistent so that they can get something from you and then exploit your expectation of consistency. And again, I'm not picking on Putin here. This is what humans do. And because of that, we assume that agents are based on intentions and perspectives, how they feel and what they want, rather than on something mechanistic. So whereas here we have a kind of causal mechanism, here behavior is predicted from a sense of intention and perspective. Then when we make predictions, here we use mechanical deduction. If the object works this way, then it will be more likely to behave this way. But here we need intention. So we do what's called an embodied, what cognitive science shows, we do a kind of embodied simulation or imagination. How do I feel that they would behave? If I were them, what would I do? If I intend to do this, what would be my behavior and so forth? And because of this, we take then different inputs into building these theories. We know this in science. We build theories from propositions with defined terms, right? We know how to do science, right? We have to have a clearly defined measurement. We have to make logical connections between them. But here we use different kinds of cues that stimulate perspective taking and simulation. So for example, our body uses mirror neurons to infer the bodily state of others. Right? We ask the question: is this person able to intimidate others? Right? We see a picture here, and we say, "Oh, when we see this picture, our mirror neurons actually like try to sort of take on his posture in our minds. We don't even realize we're doing this, and we feel like, oh, that's pretty. He's strong and tough because I feel strong and tough when my mind mirrors." Similarly here, this stare that he gives shows a kind of resolve that our mirror neurons pick up to infer his internal bodily state. We say, oh, he's very determined, right? And by contrast, this is a famous picture from the US. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but this individual was attempting to look like this, and he failed because when people looked at the picture, they thought, this guy's not tough. When he's trying to look tough, he fails. His body language is not correct, and he lost the elections. Michael Dukakis, he lost the election. Also, situational behavioral reaction. You look at how do people react. These are our inputs, right? So here, how does this person respond to threats? We know that Putin does not want to get COVID. He's made that very clear, and his response is very kind of aggressive, so to speak. He will not, he doesn't mind being impolite in order to stay safe. And that's expressed clearly here by this very long table. Similarly, a lot of people thought, I'm not taking a position here, but just a lot of people thought that like this guy's a comedian, actor, Zelensky, he's not, if you threaten him, he will fold. And he specifically shows that that's not true by taking this picture where he's kind of in the city with the soldiers during the invasion. Right? So since the theories of mind have different assumptions, a different basis of prediction, different inputs, implies that they're communicated differently. Right? So let's talk about communication. Right? What we're going to do here is this blue person is going to try to get this blue person to think about what they're thinking about here. Now, how do they do this? Here, right, to communicate a mechanistic model, I use logic and argument. Right? I tell the logic and argument here, and it gives an image of the same mechanistic model here. How do I do this over here? Right? How do I communicate my inner imagination? I imagine Zelensky is this way, and I want to tell you that he is that way. How do I do that? Right? I could try to use arguments, but they're not going to fit because, as I just showed you, I built my impressions of him from a bunch of things that don't, not defined concepts. There's no propositions. It's images, it's reactions, it's my mirror neurons. I can't translate those easily into arguments. So what do I do? Well, it turns out researchers have shown that narrative is actually something that does this really well. Because what narrative does is it turns on and engages the imagination, the very simulation apparatus from which theories of mind make predictions. It does this partly by what's called transportation, which is it makes us feel like the thing is happening to us while we read the story. The key difference between Uncle Tom's Cabin and the narrative and Uncle Tom's Cabin, the Facts and Documents is when you read Uncle Tom's Cabin, the narrative, you feel like a slave, or you feel like a slave master. You feel like you're there, and you're interacting with the characters as though they're a part of your life. And when you read this set of facts and tables and interviews, you don't feel that way because you're not transported. Here you are transported. So this actually engages your ability to predict what would slaves do? What would slaveholders do? You get that from this because you're transported. You don't get that from this. Okay, so let's give an example here of how we can evoke theory of mind, or what I call character, through narrative detail, how we can kind of make the simulation real. Mulan, actually there's been many things written about Mulan. There's a play from the 16th century called The Female Mulan. And one of the ways that they evoke the kind of point of view and sacrifice and kind of challenge that Mulan faced to sort of put you in her point of view is that she explains her situation to the audience, buys some military equipment, and then the important thing is she unbinds her feet. And to the audience of the 16th century, this notion that she would unbind her feet demonstrates the kind of level of transformation that she's undergoing, because foot binding was a very common and well understood practice that, like many in everyone in the audience would understand. So it transports them like, oh, she's unbinding her feet. To see her doing that is for them to imagine what it would be like for them to see someone doing that or to do that themselves, right? So what we want is this evocative narrative. I want to tell a story about him or about Putin or Mulan, it doesn't matter, that evokes the same imagination, that sort of stimulates the simulation process in the mind. Now, if that's how they work, we can then ask the question, how do different kinds of theories then react to misinformation? What undermines prediction? Or what can render a theory useless? And here we know for science that without logic and definition, predictions fail. I can't make a clear deduction. But here, it's without evocation and transportation that prediction fails, right? I can't imagine him. I don't have a feel for him. Like if you argue to me that Zelensky is a certain way, but I can't imagine him, I can't predict his behavior, and I can't make the relational decision. So let's think about false facts. How do they work? I'll remind you, I just mentioned that Mulan unbound her feet. Well, it turns out that's definitely false, because even if there was a real Mulan, she didn't bind her feet in 4th or 5th century China during the Northern Wei dynasty, because foot binding doesn't come in for like 300 or 400 years later. So she didn't bind her. Even if there was a Mulan, that's false. And so if you take this as a fact and try to understand something about Northern Wei dynasty, you are going to be misled. False information. It's going to contradict things that you know. It's going to send you into a kind of confusion, right? There's a logical contradiction that carries through this mechanistic model. But let's think about imagining Mulan's perspective. And again, we're told this false information. Mulan unbound her feet. Okay, but to the audience of the 16th century who was told this, were they misled? Because even if there were, whether or not there is a real Mulan back then, for them to be transported and to understand how she would feel, they need to engage with details that they can imagine, that they can simulate. Perhaps there was some other practice in the 5th century that Mulan actually could have engaged in. But if you tell that to the 16th century audience, they don't understand what it means. They can't imagine themselves doing it because they don't do it. But by replacing what she may have done with something that they could simulate and do, it better conveys her state of mind. You actually have better understanding of Mulan through this false detail than you would potentially through a true detail, right? It may introduce some noise to the process, but it still communicates something. So in other words, it's possible, and I'm a little behind time, so I don't want to rush, but I want to be sure. Possible to get objectively false information, right? She unbound her feet. No, she didn't. But relationally, in character or mind, true information. It correctly conveys the character or the intentions, the perspectives of the person, even though it's false. And I'll give an example of this. Like, how can something be true and also false? Well, here was a study by Kapfer, something called the Leaflet of Village Juif. The Leaflet of the Village Juif was a thing that was passed around in France near the Village Juif hospital, and it claimed that the hospital held this sort of secret document that had all these tests that showed that different food additives and food products were carcinogenic, meaning they had linked to cancer. And it's objectively false. There were no such tests. The leaflet was fabricated, completely made up. Not true. But Kapfer in his research showed that it was relationally true because it actually accurately portrayed the intentions of these food companies toward the public. And the way that he showed this was that when the companies were asked to kind of expose the leaflet for being false, they kind of declined to do so and become public about it because they didn't want to be in the healthiness of their foods to be investigated, because they knew in particular that there was a lot of sugar in what they were providing, and that was dangerous. And so in a way, the document is wrong, it's a fake, right? But it is true in the sense that they were hiding information. They just weren't hiding this information. They were hiding different information, not about cancer, but say about diabetes. Okay. So if a false story can be relationally accurate, then might it sometimes be more functional or preferred, like better at communicating? And here we're going to see that yes, it can. Here we're going to look at the character, the state of mind, the intentions of the US government during the Vietnam War. So this is a story about that. That's objectively false. I know most of you are too young probably to know this. It's an American movie, but bear with me. It's a famous, very famous American movie called Rambo. And the whole idea, this is Sylvester Stallone. He's a famous actor in the US, and this is in the 1980s. And the whole idea was he's this hero, he's a Vietnam veteran, and he goes back to Vietnam to rescue what were called the POWs, prisoners of war, because there was this idea that like American soldiers had just been left in Vietnam because the US government had kind of betrayed them and sort of left them there and sort of exited. And so he was going to go back and get them. And there's a whole movie where he fights all these people and he saves them. Right? And it's objectively false. In fact, the US government did a whole study of POWs. There are no POWs. Not true. But it turned out it's kind of relationally true, because there was a Pentagon Papers, was a report actually released long before this, which showed that the US government did, in a sense, abandon American soldiers to die in Vietnam, in the sense that the American government knew that the US was not likely to prevail. It was like a hopeless war, and yet they continued to draft people and send them there, even though they knew it was kind of pointless. And so they were kind of treating them as though they were abandoned them, not literally as prisoners of war, but like they betrayed their trust and abandoned them to a horrible fate. So it was relationally true. So here you say, well, I've got an objectively true story and a relationally true story. Shouldn't I prefer this one? But this is highly evocative communication. You're transported into the narrative. It's highly physical. You can imagine being there. Right? And this, it's noted, I point this out in the paper, it's a very abstruse technical document that is very hard to follow. It doesn't transport you at all. It's very hard. So the relational portion, like what was the attitude or intention of the US government, is really hard to get at here. It's hard to simulate that point of view, whereas here it's quite easy. Provide another example. I'm trying to connect with my audience here. So this one I hope people will know, right? Instead of Sylvester Stallone, let's look at Bruce Lee, right? So this is, I think people will know this. I was informed that this is something that people know. This is from the American title of this, the English title of this is Fists of Fury, right? Where he shows he kind of returns the sick man of Asia sign to sort of assert that like China is not going to be kind of pushed around by imperialists and sort of enemies any longer, right? This idea. But it's not just that he sort of like makes this claim on writing, right? He does something very evocative, right? You have this, I watched the scene a few times. It's like he demonstrates physically his kind of assertion of strength, right? And you see the enemies, and you see all the people that are sort of trying to essentially weaken China, and China is resisting physically. And this makes it evokes the simulation. If you are in either of these positions, the character, this is China asserting itself. These are the others coming against it. Much stronger than, say, if there were like an essay written that kind of like proved that like logically that, the economic strength, the GDP of China is going to grow and these kind of things, right? It's like, it doesn't show character in the same way. So again, we have a fictional story that conveys a kind of truth, right? But it's fiction. So one thing that we might worry about then, and I'm going to get to the computational implications of this very soon. One thing we might worry about is like, well, how do we warrant character claims then? Because I basically just told you that like, well, fiction can be true. So then like, well, can anything be true? And this is important. We're going to talk about this. For objects, properties, predictions derived from facts and principles combined with logic, the way that we warrant a claim, we know this, of course, as scientists, is with evidence. When I argue you should accept a property truth, I'm saying you should believe it because it is consistent with the evidence. We all know this is what we do as science. But I just told you that doesn't really work here, because I might give you something the evidence is not true. I might say, oh, Mulan unbound her feet, but actually we know she didn't. So like, how can I But here, there's something else we can do. When I tell a story indicating you should accept a character truth, what I'm really saying is you should believe it because this is how I imagine it. Like my imagination of Mulan, of Putin, of Zelensky, of China, of the US government is like this. And I would like to evoke it in you because I think that my imagination is worthy of your attention. And so the warrant is really in the source, in me, not in the evidence. We're going to talk about those important computational implications, which we'll get to. Okay, so let's get into the implications, right? We have two kinds of information that serve two different functions. It stands to reason that sometimes they will compete, and people will sacrifice one, the one they value less, to get the other, the one they value more, right? This means that misinformation could be a symptom of a demand for narratives to inform relational decisions. In other words, if misinformation can be useful for conveying character information that we need to make relational decisions, sometimes we might say, I'm so in need or desperate for this kind of character information that, of course, I'd rather not have this information. But if I can't get it with the true information, I'll take it with the misinformation. Because I need this so much. So let's think about how we can use this to predict when and where this information might be prevalent and setting us up for some computational study. So one is that people will tolerate, this is the main principle of the argument, people will tolerate misinformation, harmful kind of symptom, when they really want that mind or character information, and they need it. So one is when they are considering communicating about relational decisions as opposed to execution decisions. If people are thinking about something as a relational decision, then they need this kind of information. If they're not getting it, then they might seek they'll take what they can get, basically, and that might include misinformation. So it's Earth Day today. This would be a good example. Climate change. We tend to think about climate change as like an execution decision, right? Like how much carbon are we putting in? Like how fast? We need to know like how fast is the Earth warming? We think of it as like very scientific, right? But actually, there's good reasons to suspect that most people actually think about it as a relational decision, not an execution decision. Not how much carbon should we keep out of the atmosphere, but like how are we going to cooperate to change our behavior? Right? Like in different nations, you might imagine, like as an American, I might say, well, what is the Chinese perspective on climate change? What is the Indian perspective on climate change? Similarly, in China, you might say, well, what do Americans think? Are they really going to follow through? Are the Europeans really going to follow through? Those are all character inferences that require a theory of mind to make relational decisions. So the information we need is really about that, not about like carbon. So this sets us up for some computational work. Like, how are people thinking about a social problem? This suggests that whether they will favor misinformation has something to do with how they're thinking about it. Do they talk about people or objects as causes of problems? We can observe this in online discourse. Are people talking about people? Are they talking about objects? Even on climate change, are they talking about governments, corporations? Are they talking about like carbon molecules? Because if they're talking about governments and corporations, you should expect that there's going to be some misinformation because they're trying to tell stories. They need to tell those stories. Similarly, what do they search for? Do they search for people-oriented or object-oriented information, right, around climate, right? Because that tells you something about like what kind of decision they think they're making, and therefore what kinds of information and misinformation they're going to look for and tolerate, right? Similar point here, another example. What about the cost of searching for or finding sort of relational information, evocative facts that sort of transport us in mind? Right? How hard is it to find information that is useful for execution decisions or relational decisions? You can think of this as path distances between key characters and concepts. What is the distance in mainstream media or social media between the ideas that we need to understand and the characters that are involved? So, for example, going back to China, as an American, if I wanted to search and find out what the Chinese government's attitude towards climate change was, how hard would it be for me to find that? If I'm searching for it and I can't find it, right, this means that there's a greater incentive for others to supply that with misinformation. To say, I know how the Chinese think. They think like this, right? And to just give me that, and I say, well, I'll take what I can get, at least from people that I trust, right? And when I think about what entities are covered by news outlets, how often does information about a particular entity reach individuals in a particular place in the network and so forth. Another aspect of predicting when people will tolerate misinformation is, well, are they expected when they produce messages, when they communicate, to talk about characters using facts and logic? Do we kind of require people to act like scientists when they really want to tell stories? Let's say I wanted to tell you my perspective, which I'll just give it, which is that, like, I don't think this is going to end anytime soon, because when I look at these pictures, I see two guys that are not going to give in. He's not giving in, and he's not giving in. That's what I think. This is Drew's personal opinion, right? Now, part of me feels like, well, can I just show you these pictures to tell you that's why I think that? Do I have to pretend that this is based on some kind of like logical scientific inference? It's not. It's based on my impressions of their character. But when you require people to sort of take character impressions and convert them into logic and facts, factual arguments, it incentivizes them to kind of create facts to make it sound logical. So one computational question is like, what are the norms in different discussion spaces? When and where is it more or less tolerable to present your imagination, especially through narrative, rather than facts and evidence? My argument here is when you create a space that requires people to make arguments, even for things that are better conveyed through narrative, you kind of have no choice but to try to, not no choice, but it makes it harder for them. And so they'll come up with fake facts. Basically say, see, it's logical. When in fact, it was never logical. It was built from their impression. And finally, this is something, this is new, this is actually all about in the paper. This is not in the paper. So this is really interesting to think about for this group. Predicting where it can happen. Computational question. This idea of an imagination network. Whose fictions do I believe? It's kind of a different question than like whose facts do I believe? Specifically, whose imagination will I allow to evoke my own imagination? So here's an individual, right? The question is not like what facts will they believe or who do they trust as sources of sort of fact, but like who's allowed to invade their or infiltrate their imagination. And somehow, I don't know how to do this, but somehow it would be interesting to think about building an imagination network, right? That this individual has an influence on this individual's imagination, has an influence on this individual's imagination. This individual's this individual, she's very central in the imagination network, influencing lots of imaginations, right? And that's through fiction or tales. That's through things that aren't strictly factual. And that can be very different from the property or fact trust network. You know, maybe this individual believes facts, or what's a good example where they're distinct? This individual believes facts go this way, but the imagination doesn't go that way. And there could be two different networks, one of fact and one of imagination. And that's kind of where I wanted to end, because this is a new thing, the argument made, but I have not even begun to think about how to do that. And I think this is a good place to stop. And I'll say thank you so much for your time and attention. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for this very enlightening and insightful talk. I really, I was really feel greatly enlightened because, you know, Dr. Margolin always maintains a very special theoretical sensitive in his work. I find it very theoretical rich and very enlightening. So now, shall we open the floor and invite the audience to pose the questions? You can either open your camera and open your audio and talk, or you can type your questions in the chat box. Either is fine.
Yeah, if I'm going to stop sharing just so I can be sure I can see the chat, or stop I know what I need to do. I think I need to, I'll share, but I will not be in slideshow. So give me a minute here.
I think here is a question in the chat box.
Do you see Facebook as an object or agent of both? That's a great question. Okay, so I love that question. So I actually have a slide about this, and maybe I'll share it, about how objects and agents, object and agency is a subjective decision and could vary. So I put it here, it's in the eye of the beholder. So like the sun, for example. To us, it's an object, but to the ancient Greeks, it's an agent, right? It's Apollo, moves the sun around. And I think it's important to remember. And in the case of Facebook specifically, there was this, I think it's both, in the sense that the algorithms themselves are, they're agents, but they're really sort of like beyond human control. Let me say that we don't have like any sort of facility to understand them as characters, to simulate them in our minds. And so in that sense, they're really best predicted and understood through like objective analysis, doing audits and so forth. However, it's very hard for us not to conceive of and to consider the fact that those algorithms are still designed by humans with motives and intentions. And you see this, and it's actually a case where like probably we should think of it almost more like an object, but it's almost impossible for us to do so. And you see this in that, I forget the name of the film, it was recent, it was very popular in the US. It was called, I forget the name, but it was all about how manipulative Facebook is, it wasn't, I forget the name, but they embodied the algorithm. They actually had the algorithm played by actors because it was almost like impossible for people to conceive of something manipulating them that didn't have social agency. And so I think it's both, and I think how we handle it is sort of a decision we have to make. Yeah, that's right. I agree with that. That like ultimately because there's oversight by humans, it's like an agent. But as an adaptive sort of entity, it's hard. What I would say is it probably is an agent, but our simulation, intuitive kind of wiring for how agents operate does not predict it well, which is why it's frustrating to us. It like thinks not like a human does. It's a super interesting question, though. It's worth pondering more. Thank you for that question. Okay, there's another one here.
Yeah.
Who are deciding? Yes, it's the listener is essentially deciding whether it's executive. Like you're making a decision. The information you want depends on kind of how you perceive the world. So if you think, in fact, there's evidence, I cited in the paper, like the economy. A lot of people, at least in the West, think of the economy as like an object, like, oh, it's this complex system, and like, supply and demand, and it has all these rational principles, and the economy. There are a lot of people that actually think of the economy as like a character, like it's controlled by like capitalists, or it's controlled by like, the wealthy and kind of manipulated for their benefit. And so they see like what's happening in the economy as like the result of like choices by social agents. So each person kind of, I'm not sure you can get aware of it in your own mind. Once I did this research, I started noticing in my own life, like what do I think of as a character? What do I think of as an object? Or sometimes like my wife and I disagree because like I see it as one and she sees it as the other. And you realize you're using like different type of reasoning to think about it. But it is in the mind of the listener. And then the narrator can kind of not exploit, but like if you're a listener who sees it as an agent and you're not getting the information you need, the narrator can then fill in that gap for you and say, I can tell you a story that fills your need. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you.
I see someone raised a hand. Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. I feel a little bit nervous because I'm in Shenzhen, I'm not in Hong Kong. So I'm not talking to my colleague for a long time, and I feel really happy to see Celine's face. I mean, yeah. Yeah, anyways, so my name is Jing. I'm a PhD student last year, gonna graduate, and I teach a course called Deceptive Communication for HKBU, and also UIC, like in China in Mandarin. So I was just so excited when I see the email and see, misinformation, and it's from the narrative kind of perspective. So I have two questions for this fascinating seminar leader. I don't know, I'm just a little bit weird now, forgive me. My first question is about is kind of from a idea, is because I entered in the talk a little bit late. I'm sorry, but I see from the lecture that we got predicting when and predicting where. I don't know if I missed predicting who or predicting what. I don't know, but this this kind of thinking, like predicting where and when, or when and where, is more like situational kind of point of view, right? So I just really want to understand how you came up with predicting when and where, or maybe who or what. This is my
Great.
first question.
Yeah, that's a great question. So let me answer that first. It's really just from, there's no, I don't have a clear sense of how to predict who or what, because, I mean, the who you might think about, like, actually, that's not true, because in the paper I talk about, like, who it will be about is going to be important characters or relational decisions are going to be made. So, like, the more important person for your investment, the more, as a social agent, the more you're going to demand that information. So, for example, right now, I would expect that Putin and Zelensky have a lot of misinformation flying around about them because they're important. In particular, Zelensky. Now, Putin's been important for a long time, but Zelensky became important. So suddenly there's going to be lots of stories about him. A lot of them will not be true because people are basically trying to gossip about him to learn about him. So the who is definitely something I just didn't happen to put it here. Thank you for that. It was an omission. The what, that's really interesting and complicated because, of course, part of the what is sort of local to it makes sense to the audience. I go back to the example of Mulan and her feet, right? That was a what that made sense to that audience for that narrator. Like, he knew that if I say this, they will understand. But so often as researchers, we won't know those whats. I'm not saying it can't happen, but like, what will be the detail that resonates, that conveys the theory of mind within this community? If you're not in that community, I think it might be researchable, it might be super interesting, but I don't have a strong intuition of like how you would know. Whereas once you see it, you see like, oh, maybe they're doing this, but it might be hard to predict, like sort of like what people will say if you don't know that community well. But maybe that's not true. That's a really interesting question. So thank you for that. And what's your second question?
My second question is about, so in the end, you talk about imagination and fact, right? So the influencing, like my imagination is influencing other people's imagination, or I say a fact that that influence other people's, I don't know, fact checking or decision or whatever.
Right.
So, oh yes, this one, yes, I love this one. And I really like the way you put it. It's really comparative, and it's really easy to see the differences. My question is that if it's we all know that imagination can go wild. That's why we have fiction, we have poetry, literature, like all these things, and music. But can imagination be considered as misinformation? So if imagination is always, because my imagination is true to myself, but maybe it's not true to other people, then how can we really say, we are, I don't know how to put it. Like,
yes, no, it's a great, I know what you're saying. Yes. Yes, excellent question. Thank you so much. Yes, that's partly why I don't have like a great answer because I think it's challenging, but I think we have to acknowledge the reality of the power of imagination, right? Like, I feel like researchers for a long time, we sort of, because it's like hard to deal with it, we're just like, well, let's just make sure we think about things that aren't imagined, when in fact they're really important. So I think the practical way of thinking about it is about the decisions that you make. So like your imagination is misleading. It's not false, but it can be misleading when like you imagine someone that actually would be trustworthy is untrustworthy, or vice versa. So like if you are tricked by someone, you trust them and they take advantage of you, then your imagination misled you. Right? Or the other way around, perhaps you distrust someone, you get angry at a friend, and you think that they've done something to you because of how you thought that they felt. You know, you did this to me to be mean, but really you did it out of concern. Then, so your imagination can be sort of misleading. It's not false in the sense of that it's verifiable, provable to be true or false, but it can kind of like guide decisions against the way you would have wanted them to go. Now, how we interrogate that, how we sort of improve people's imagination, I'm not sure that there's a clear way, but in the paper I argue, and this is kind of the main point, the way to do it is definitely not with fact. Like you can't use fact only or even substantially to change people's imagination. You have to engage in the narrative process. You have to give paralinguistic cues and so forth. And so we can improve our imaginations and get them sort of more in line with our interests and that make them less misleading. But facts are only a small part of, providing fact is only a small part of doing that. Kind of way. But it's super interesting to think about. I haven't thought that through as much.
Thank you so much for your answer. I mean, still, like we don't really have like exact answers, but I know I get what you mean, and I really appreciate it. And I think it's a little bit connected to my first question. And your answer was, if I remember it wrong, you said what the question, the predicting what is really difficult. That's why it's really difficult, because how can you know like their imagination is true or false? Can you say like their because you want to have evocative communication, right?
Yes.
If we want evocative communication, we will have a little bit of like distorted details that is really imaginative and really influential, but at the same time, like on the fact part, might be a little bit compromised. Yeah.
Exactly. Well said. I was very well said. Thank you. I wish I could mentally record that and say it again, because that's how it should be said. Excellent.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I appreciate this opportunity to talk to my fellow researchers. I'm so happy.
Actually, the last time I saw Jingwei was a long time ago. So Jingwei was waiting me finishing a presentation. In that presentation, I introduced the Juice work, that article in communication theory. So that's the last time I actually met Jingyuan. So also is in that presentation, I think Juice paper on communication theory. So, yeah, so it's about that paper. Okay, so how about, yeah.
Oh, I have nothing else to say. I'm retardedly happy now. Sorry.
Okay, yeah. So can I have a follow-up question? Yeah, because in Juice talk, Ju just introduced an example using like climate change, and also Ju used, I think, a lot of very enlightening and very interesting examples in this talk. So I was just wondering, in formulating, I think Ju has a very comprehensive theoretical framework regarding these informative fictions. So I was wondering, in this conceptual framework, is there any like special characteristics for different issue categories of misinformation? For example, climate change, perhaps like science misinformation, and there are also like other like election news. That's a kind of like political genre of fake news. So because objects and agents, yes, all these are very fascinating elements in constructing this theoretical work. So I was wondering how issue categories play in this role in this theoretical framework. So are there like
that's a great question, and I think let's see how to answer that. So I haven't thought about it too much. I'm thinking about it a little bit. It's an excellent question. So the first thing I would say is that character versus property, or execution, relational versus execution, are kind of natural to some domains and unnatural to others. So for example, politics versus science. in politics, the relational is actually the basic decision. And so I think that in some ways we in the US, I don't know what it's like in other nations, but in the US, we become increasingly sort of like expecting that that we have a kind of scientific attitude towards politicians, which doesn't really make any sense, because like actually narrative to convey character information is the kind of like natural or more functional form of communication about politics, because you're voting for people or supporting people and the decisions they're going to make. Kind of making even there, you're voting for something like that. Right? In that case, I think the attitude should be like, in some ways, like we should expect things to be character and narrative. And if we don't see very much fact, or fact is sort of marginalized, that's kind of okay. The other issue is like science. It's sort of invading and sort of being problematic. One of the things we see so much in conspiracy theories, one of the things that we're seeing is that scientists are presenting factual information, but people are resisting them with basically conspiracy theories, which are about their agency. So people will say, like, I don't believe that the vaccine in the US will be like, oh, the vaccines aren't going to work because it's like Pfizer wants to control you, they want to put a chip in you or something. Where something that should have been really about like objects gets converted into something that's about character. And that's kind of a distortion. So it's like in some places it's, and I think part of the blurring of that is that we're not really acknowledging, at least in the US context, the importance of character information. So the fact that we try to sort of make everything seem like it's scientific makes it so that we don't acknowledge like where it's proper and where it's sort of more problematic, and sort of create those spaces. So I would like to see, this doesn't really answer your question, but stimulated by it, I would like to see more effort to kind of create spaces for both, where you say, hey, let's talk about what the science says, assuming scientists are trustworthy. It's like a specific thing that we kind of like define as an assumption. And then let's also talk about whether scientists are trustworthy in like a different space, and not like blend them together. So that when I say the vaccine is safe, you don't, not you, but the person doesn't say, no, scientists are out to get me. Like that's, those are, one's a property inference, how does the vaccine work, and the other is an agent, character inference, like what are the intentions of scientists? We want to kind of separate those. That would be kind of whether that's happening. Are they overly mixed in some spaces? Are they well defined in other spaces? That's a kind of empirical question. I have not given much thought to it. It's a really great question.
Yeah. Okay, so are there any questions? Okay, so if there are no more questions, shall we give a big hand to Dr. Margolin? It's really a very fascinating talk. Thank you so much.
We see one more question here. I think that that's a great question about fact checking. I think that it's very important to have facts documented. However, I think that this idea, the very idea, and this probably came from my observations of fact, the way fact checking is used. Very often fact checking is used to kind of invalidate narratives, to say like, oh, the story you're telling is false, and therefore, you sort of just disqualify the attempt to communicate character. And I think this is really not helpful. I think it just makes people distrust fact checking and kind of misses the point. So I do think that fact checking is important. I think we need to know what the accurate facts are, but I do feel that it's very often kind of weaponized as a way to kind of to take this, because we talked about Mulan's story, like if you were inspired by Mulan and then I tell you she doesn't exist, she didn't exist, there was no Mulan, to say like you shouldn't feel inspired, but that's completely not correct, right? Like it's perfectly valid to find the story relevant to one's own decisions about how it feels to be in a certain situation, even if it's technically not true. Very often, in my observation of fact checking online, people use it to kind of dismiss, even in that one case, this person thinks that Bill Clinton is, a sort of slimy person, which was true, and that it caused mental anguish. He caused mental anguish to young women, true. But oh, you can't say this because technically that's not true. And it's sort of missing the point, and I think creates distrust around something that we want actually more trust. So thank you for that question.
Okay, so if no more questions, shall we give a big hand to Dr. Margolin? Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you for the opportunity. I really had fun preparing for this because I knew this was going to be an audience that would kind of challenge me to think about it in different ways. And you know, I did not, you might not suspect this, but I had not thought of Mulan before preparing for this talk. And so I started investigating it, and it worked very nicely. So it sort of just shows the sort of like, you know, we can find stories that are relevant to each other and to make the point. So I appreciate it. I had all American examples in my previous talk. They're not going to understand any of these, so cut them out.
That example is really resonating. The Mulan.
Good.
Yeah.
I'm glad.
And Bruce Lee, because it also has special meaning in the context of Hong Kong.
Yes. Yeah, Vincent cued me into those. He was like, "Oh, you got to use Bruce Lee." I was like, "Okay."
So we are looking forward to your visit to us and your talk to us in person.
Yes, absolutely. Okay. Thank you so much, everyone. And yeah, I will see you when I see you.
Yeah, I just saw a question on the chat. Yeah, we will post the video on the YouTube. Yeah, because this is our distinguished lecture series, so you'll be able to find the video on our YouTube channel. Okay, so thank you.
All right, thank you all.
Thank you.
Take care.